Well, is Pat McGann still here? Is he here? Seriously? Let me just tell you something, pal. I know comedy, I know funny, and you're brilliantly funny. Just want to say that. The only problem is David has to get out of here by 9 o'clock. So it wasn't Pat's fault. I want to tell you all what a joy it is to be here. Jim Lane said to me, do you think you could do something like maybe interview somebody on Saturday night? And I said, well, Jim, I love doing that. I do that at Socrates in the City. I do it all the time. Who would you want me to get? He said, what about David Brooks? I said, I don't know. I'll see if he can come. And I emailed him, and he said he could come. And he's here. David, thank you for being here. Since we're out of time, let me ask my last question. How can we get this lovely product? You're a tremendous writer. David's book, this is just going to put Paul Young in his place. David's book is currently #1. Is that correct? Not on the New York Times bestseller list. Way better than that. On Amazon, #1. It must feel good to be in the top 1. Anyway, David, in the few minutes we have together, let me ask you the question that every author gets asked. This is the big question. This is a book on character. People aren't writing about character. My first question is, why did you write this book? Or let me rephrase it. Why in the world did you write this book?
Okay, first, thank you for, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to be brief, not because I kind of go, not because I have to go, because I know you didn't actually come here to hear me speak. I've been around a lot of you guys for a little while, and I know you came here to hear yourself speak. And so I'll try to get out of the way of that.
Second question, is nastiness a virtue? Oh, now, come on. No, but unfortunately, I hear you, bro. Keep going.
So, everyone's life has certain transformations. I grew up on the left in Greenwich Village in New York City.
That's redundant, by the way.
I was social. My parents were hippies, so they took me to Central Park when I was 5 at a be-in where hippies would go just to be. And they put a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. So I reached my hand in it, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was sort of my first step over to the right. And so that was the first transformation. And then there were a lot of other transformations. I started from Chicago. I went to Chicago, a school where a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And then I became a columnist in the New York Times, a conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I likened to being chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there.
Did Pat write this material for you? Be honest.
I'm trying to keep the spirit in tow. But then, certain things happen in your life. And so I work at a show on PBS called The News Hour with Jim Lehrer. I do a segment with Mark Shields, called Shields and Brooks. Thank you. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields. But that
relative of Mark Shields in the back?
Yeah. And so I'm driving home one day. It's summer. It's 7:30. And I pull into my house, then in Bethesda, Maryland here. And the driveway goes around the side of the house, so I see in the backyard. And it's like a perfect summer evening. The sun is coming through the trees. The grass looks perfect. My 3 kids, who are then 12, 9, and 4, are in the backyard. And they got one of those balls you buy at the supermarket, and they're kicking it up in the air. And it's curving in the wind, and they're running across the yard and tumbling all over each other, laughing their heads off as they try to get to the ball. And I pull into the side, and I'm suddenly surprised by this tableau in front of me. And so I just stare at it through the windshield. And it's one of those moments when time and space seem to spill outside its bounds. And you get overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude and by a sense of getting a happiness that's higher than anything you'll ever get on the job and is more than you'll ever deserve. And when that happens, and we in the room know the word for that, which is grace, when that happens, you want to be worthy of those moments. And you want to be worthy of people who generate an inner light that you occasionally meet. And so, I was doing great in my career, but when I see people with an inner light, when you feel that flood of grace, you think, well, I have a lot of success, but I don't have that. And you want to be worthy of that. And so that set me off on a course of 4 or 5 years trying to figure out how other people got that.
I think everybody here would go, yep, I get it. But I want to go deeper and ask this question. Why do you think there are so many people that go through life who don't have that thought that you had? In other words, let's not pretend that everyone has that thought. Not only did you have the thought, but you wrote a book about it.
Yeah. So I think we're all blessed by moral imagination. We all want to lead a meaningful life. I teach at Yale, as I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into, unlike Eric. None of my kids are like you, strangely. But they are like super achievement kids. To get into Yale is a phenomenal thing. They all have started 3 companies, cure formerly fatal diseases. I ask them, what are you doing on spring break? It's like, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers. So they're like, but what they do not have is a moral vocabulary, except for the religious kids. But the secular kids want to be good. One of my kids took me to coffee. He said, we're so hungry, but they don't have a vocabulary. They don't have even words like grace. They don't have words like sin. They don't have words like soul. They just don't have the vocabulary. And so I think they're frustrated. There's a guy at Notre Dame, Christian Smith, who's a sociologist, who went around the country asking college students, name your last moral dilemma. 70% of them could not name a moral dilemma. They'd say, I pulled into a parking space, I didn't have any quarters. And he would say, it's sort of a problem. It's not really a moral dilemma. And so what the secular world as a whole needs is a moral vocabulary. And so I just tried to bring it to them. And myself, too. I don't put myself separate from that.
Well, so, this brings me to the larger question. If I were doing this for Socrates in the city, first of all, we wouldn't have started with Family Feud. But
Wheel of Fortune.
I would, but I would ask the large question. The large question is, can we be good without God? Can we have a moral vocabulary without God? You seem to imply in the book that on some level, yes, and I just want to ask that question.
So personally, I think it's harder to be good without God, but I just observe empirically. I know a lot of wonderful people of faith. I know a lot of people of faith who are schmucks. I know a lot of wonderful secular
Point them out. Go ahead. I don't care.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Point them out.
I know a lot of wonderful secular people. So I know atheists who I think are great human beings.
Well, there's no question
But let me get to the vocabulary question, because I think that's the crucial one. I do think you need the vocabulary. You need a language of moral growth. One of the people I talk about in the book is Dwight Eisenhower. So Eisenhower, when he was 9, he had a temper problem. His mom, this remarkable woman named Ida Eisenhower, he wanted to go trick-or-treating when he was 9. His mom would not let him. He punches a tree in his front yard, and he punches it so bad he rubs all the skin off his fingers. She sends him to his room, lets him cry for an hour, and she comes up and binds his wounds, and she recites a verse from Proverbs. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And 60 years later, when he wrote his memoirs, he said that was the most important conversation of his life, because he taught him he had a sin, his temper, and he had spent the rest of his life defeating his sin, which he did. He created this equipoise. And he was a hater, naturally. He would take, but he knew he had to fight it. He couldn't lead that way. And so he'd write people's names he hated on pieces of paper, and he'd rip them up and throw them in the garbage can. And he made himself strong in his weakest spot. And if you don't have a vocabulary of sin, you don't have a vocabulary of self-defeat, you don't have a vocabulary of soul, know that there's something worth fighting for, then I just think it's hard to do it. So Abraham Lincoln's faith was very complicated, but he grew up with the King James Bible, and he had the vocabulary. And I think you need the vocabulary. I just observe empirically there are some wonderful people who are not faithful.
Well, I mean, there's no question. Some years ago at Socrates in the City, I had Father Newhouse, Father Richard John Newhouse. Many of you know him. And the question that he was asking and answering that evening was, can an atheist be a good citizen? And he went on, and then at the end said, and so, in the end, I'm afraid we must conclude, no. You know, and I thought, that's certainly not the answer I'm looking for, because I understand technically what he meant, but it seems obvious that an atheist can be a good citizen, or an atheist can be a good person. But I guess when you talk about having a moral vocabulary, is there a way to even have a moral vocabulary apart from faith? How is that possible? Do you think it's possible to invent that? What are you thinking when you say those things?
Well, I think the first thing you need is what I call a biblical metaphysic. Kids are raised today to think they're wonderful. One of the statistics I quote in the book, in 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, are you a very important person? And in 1950, 12% said yes. They asked the same question again in 2005, and this time it wasn't 12% who thought they were a very important person, it was 80%. They have a thing called the narcissism test, where they ask young people, I'm going to read you a bunch of statements. Do these apply to you? They're statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Somebody should write a biography about me. I like to look at my body. And the median narcissism score has risen 30% in the last 20 years. So they're raised with a view that they're perfect and wonderful inside. All the commencement cliches, follow your passion, be true to yourself. But the Bible teaches us differently. It teaches us we're splendidly endowed, but also deeply broken. And you have to have an awareness of your own brokenness. Now, can you have that without active faith? I think you can. I think you can have humility without faith. And of course, personally, I think it helps to believe you're being observed. I think it helps to believe your life is part of a purpose. I think it helps to believe you're loved more than you deserved. But I just observed that I would say this is my career. I'm not a religious writer. I'm trying to take a lot of moral and religious categories and make them more pervasive in our culture. And so I'm writing as a secular writer for a secular audience.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to applaud you for that, because we clearly live in a culture where people, especially cultural elites, have shrunk from doing that, have shrunk from using a moral vocabulary as though that were itself bad. So I applaud what you're doing very much, because to try to bring this vocabulary into the secular world, as you're, I would say, uniquely able to do, is important. But I know, and I agree with it, but I know that there are people who would have theological issues. They would fuss, in a sense, and I would say fuss, that's the verb I would use, that they would fuss and say, well, in a way, being good doesn't matter. It's about salvation. You can only get salvation. Only God can rescue us from ourselves. And I would agree with that theologically. But I think what has happened in the evangelical world over the last, I don't know how many decades, is that people have become so focused on salvation is by grace and works will do nothing. They get that theologically, but they've sort of promoted it to the point where a couple of generations of serious Christians have forgotten that the work of being good is something that for 2,000 years the church not only thought about it, but practiced it. I think of my friend Frederica Matthews Green, Rod Dreher. They realize that it takes work. It's not just, well, I'm saved by grace and I'm fine. You're not fine. You're saved by grace. Okay, you can go to heaven, but you can still be a better person. And the how to be better. That's what you seem to address in your book. Rod Dreher, our mutual friend, deals with that in his book, How Dante Can Save Your Life. The idea is that you have to get serious about it. And saying that I'm getting serious about being a better person or wanting to have character doesn't mean that Jesus didn't do it all on the cross, but it does mean that I have work to do. Is it safe to say that you agree with that? You think that it seems that that's what your book is trying to do, is trying to get people to take this issue seriously, apart from the theological thing that I just said.
Yeah, a lot of my friends that are pastors, I just say, I'm your gateway drug. They're coming to me, they'll go to you. But, I think we learn from, a lot of what we learn is from example. So one of the characters in my book is a woman named Dorothy Day, who I hope everybody in this room knows. Dorothy Day was the sort of person who, when she read a novel, she just couldn't read a novel. She had to act out the characters. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so earlier in her life, she's drinking a ton, she's sleeping around a ton, abortions, 2 suicide attempts, a very disorganized life, which makes her ashamed. She has a child, and 40 minutes after the birth of her child, she sits down to write an essay about what it was like. And one of the sentences she writes at the very end is, if I had painted the greatest sculpture, written the greatest symphony, composed the greatest novel, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. And with that came a need to worship and to adore. So it was out of the love for her child, she said, I've got to worship somebody. Who am I going to worship? And that was her first introduction into faith. She becomes a Catholic and then spends the rest of her life living a life of poverty, trying to live a life like Jesus. And so she's not only creating a homeless shelter, food kitchens, a radical newspaper, she's living with them. And she's living with them for 60 years, an act of incredible self-sacrifice. And the good part comes at the end when she experiences a tranquility and joy, which is what I mean by inner light. So at the end of her life, she's like 80, and she's written all her life, but she never wrote a memoir. And so a guy named Robert Coles at Harvard asked her, why don't you write a memoir? And she said, someday I thought about doing that, and here's what happened. I got out a blank piece of paper, I wrote a life remembered at the top of the page, and I just sat there trying to think, how do I tell my story? And so I was thinking back over my life, and I thought about the Lord and his visit to us those many centuries ago, and I was just so grateful to have had him on my mind all that time. And she said, I didn't really need to write anything. That's what my life was. I was just grateful to have had him on my mind. And so that's a life of that. And so that's the inner spirit, and that's the inner joy, and that's the tranquility. And so what I try to do is tell those stories. And I'll tell you one thing. I teach 14 readings at Yale with this class, which is really the book. And I've got 24 kids in my seminar. And my final assignment is pick any of the 14 readings, Montaigne, Samuel Johnson, Pericles, and pick one of the readings and apply it to a problem in your own life. This last term, 24 students, 19 of them chose Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness as their issue because they're so impressed by her spiritual hunger and her emotional intensity. And so we learn from people. And so I think if you bring lives like that to the public view, then that's the way you communicate the larger message.
Do you think that they would have chosen Dorothy Day if she weren't politically liberal?
That I wouldn't have?
No, do you think they would have chosen? I'm just saying the climate at Yale, it's such all of the elite institutions, if she had been, that's not to devalue Dorothy Day, obviously. She was a great saint of God, frankly. But it's just it's interesting that there are people out there that you could hold out, even, forgive me, to a Yale audience, and that they would say yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm not stupid. I'm thinking this through.
No, you're not. No, you're not stupid. Let me tell you who is stupid, though. The first guy in this row in the Family Feud, where is he? Poor guy. No, actually, I take that back. About most of them were stupid, but these are friends of mine.
This is not a Christian attitude.
These are good friends of mine. Terrible. All right, but based on the Family Feud thing that just happened, I guess I shouldn't ask my question about St. Augustine. I was going to say, what do you think of St. Augustine? So I think maybe let me change that question. What do you think of Soupy Sales?
So St. Augustine is the core of the book, because the book is about sin, and St. Augustine is the great genius of sin. But again, I'm writing for a secular audience. And so the way I described St. Augustine, which is actually accurate, was that he was like my Ivy League students. He was a completely successful young rhetorician who found his life was empty. And he had a mom named Monica, who was the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. And she's like hounding him. You should do this, you should do that, you should marry her, you shouldn't marry her. He escapes from Africa to get away from her. She takes the next boat over. She follows him over to Italy. It's a life of conflict. And at the end of her life, she's 56, and she says to him, we fought all these years. I've only wanted one thing in life, for you to be a certain sort of man and a certain sort of Christian. And you are those things now. And so she says to him, I thought I was going to go die in Africa back home, but God sees me anywhere. I'm happy to die here. And in 9 days later, she does, in fact, die. And so he describes their final conversation, which takes place in a garden. And he describes, after a life of conflict, how their voices merged together in harmony for the first time. And how they rose and thought about the next life, and they rose beyond things that are worldly into things that were to come. And then he has a long sentence, which is very hard to understand, but he's got one word that repeats through that sentence, and the word is hushed. He says, the sound of our voices was hushed, the wind was hushed, the sound of the birds was hushed, our hearts were hushed, our voices were hushed, nature was hushed. And you get this sense of deep peace. And you don't have to be faithful or not to understand that, the peace between people after a life of conflict. And so that's, I think, what people are hungering for in their life. The resume side of our life, the ambitions are never satisfied. There's always something out there. But the spiritual, the eulogy side, there are moments of deep peace and tranquility. And I think everyone of all faiths, of all political stripes, is hungering for that, and they get that. So they're drawn to that if you can provide examples of how it's done. And Augustine had to go through a life of struggle to get there, but he got there.
Even, it's why we're here. It's why the New Canaan Society exists, because we all want to be better fathers, husbands, in some rare cases, haberdashers. There's 2 here. Even the guys that were on this stage, who are my friends, this is why we're here, because we care about that. We want to be better. But I do think that somehow, and you don't have to speak specifically to this, but it's just an observation that in modern day evangelicalism, I guess I can call it, I feel that we really have focused so much on grace that we've turned away from the hard work that Paul Young shared yesterday about having to heal himself from all this brokenness, because we have lost this moral vocabulary. So I guess my question is, why do you think we lost that moral vocabulary? You say in the middle of the 20th century at some time, we sort of stopped talking about sin, or maybe we're really just talking about the 60s, it was wiped away. But what do you think happened, and why did this happen?
It happened in the late 40s, and it was the erasure of that word sin. Eisenhower wasn't particularly religious, but he grew up aware of his own sinfulness. Same with George Marshall, another figure in the book. And in the 1940s, they'd been through the Depression, they'd been through World War II, and they decided, we're just going to turn the page. First thing we're going to do is we're going to spend on ourselves. Consumption just shoots up in the late 40s. Then there are a whole series of books that say, I'm going to write a new 10 Commandments. It's going to say, thou shalt love thyself, thou shalt accept thyself.
Well, let me just, you said the late 40s. Do you think prosperity had something to do with that? In other words, that America was so strong and so great and so prosperous, it would seem to me that had to have something to do with the fall.
Right, and they'd just been through the war, and they'd seen oceans of blood, and they just wanted to turn the page. And so they became very optimistic. So a book called The Mature Mind that said, thou shalt love thyself, that was number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 56 weeks. There was a market for that. Then a book called The Power of Positive Thinking comes out, number 1, 98 straight weeks. Then Dr. Spock comes out with his child care book, where he says, if your child steals something, just give him what he stole and tell him he can get whatever he desires. That's a reasonably optimistic view of human nature. And so they had that. And then it takes off. And I was talking about my book on Charlie Rose like 6 months ago, and I used the word sin, and a very top New York editor called me and said, I love the way you talked about your book, but don't use the word sin. It's so icky. And he said, use the word insensitive instead. And so I called my editor, and he said, Well, that's why we're writing the book, because we need to reintroduce that word. But so I had a struggle. How do I introduce the word sin to a secular audience? And I don't think he'd mind that I mention him, that one of my counselors through this was Tim Keller. And Tim said, well, I do it through the concept of disordered loves, that we all love a lot of things, and we all know that some things are higher than others. And that if your friend tells you a secret and you blab it at a dinner party, you're putting your love of popularity above your love of friendship, and we all know that's wrong. And that's why you can talk about sin to the whole country without talking about depravity, without talking about original sin, just talking about disordered loves, getting your loves out of order. And so there have to be ways to talk about this, to reintroduce this stuff into the public square. And to me, the shift came, in the 1950s even. There's Reinhold Niebuhr, there's Abraham Joshua Heschel, there are a lot of theologians in the public square. It's very hard now. I think maybe Keller, there's a guy named Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, maybe Os Guinness. There are very few in the public square. Maybe you. But there are very few. And that's a hollowness in our public culture.
Well, it's interesting because, as you're talking and as I'm reading your book, I realize that there are very few people, and Christians are very guilty of this, but we have really, Christians have participated in secularizing the culture by compartmentalizing faith and by saying we're all about theology and religion, and if anything isn't theologically pure, we want nothing to do with it. Now, that's not to say that theology isn't important, but if you say that, you're going to be in a tiny corner by yourself. And so we've effectively abandoned the mainstream and participated in creating a culture without a moral vocabulary, because we have, in a sense, insisted that moral vocabulary be something. I guess, as I'm hearing you talk, you realize that if we are created in God's image, and God created the world, which I know that he did, then truth is truth and reality is reality, and it's inescapable. And every human being, whether he rejects God or doesn't, will have to deal with this kind of thing. And by describing it sort of as you do in a somewhat secular way, it's not really secular, but it's secular enough that it's palatable to a secular world, you're inviting them into a reality. And I guess the reason I'm excited about the book is that I really do think that by inviting people into this reality, it's a universal reality, it's not a religious reality, you're sort of encouraging them sort of to look with you at something. And I really think that in doing that, many people will find God. I don't think that we have to first make the theological point. Now, you could be really, really good and it's not going to get you to heaven. I don't think that's always necessary. And so the fact that you do that, I think, is groundbreaking.
Yeah, let me just say one thing. This past winter, I went to a group called The Gathering in Orlando, and I gave a talk which meant a lot to me, and it was called Ramps and Walls. And it was things the Christian world, there are a lot of people who are circling around with spiritual wandering and who are searchers. And there are some things the Christian world, and specifically the evangelical world, does to build ramps to those people so they can come in, and something the world does to build walls to push them out. The ramps are just the light of certain personalities. I have a friend, Monsignor Ray East, Catholic priest in Anacostia. He just radiates joy. He's just super attractive, and that's a great message. Then the other thing the Christian world does that I think is a ramp is talk about matters of values in an honest way. When we're talking about poverty, when we're talking about what happened in Baltimore, it's not only about economics. There's also values issues, and I think the Christian world does very good on that. The walls are often the self-segregation and what I would call a mixture of an intellectual inferiority complex combined with a spiritual superiority complex. And the intellectual inferiority complex is sometimes we're not going to compete on the realm of ideas. And sometimes we're going to be too nice to ourselves. We want to be so supportive of ourselves, we won't demand the highest intellectual standards. And we were talking at a table about Wheaton College, which I'm a huge fan of. I think it's one of the best schools in America. And that's intellectual standards.
You know, Jim Lane went to Wheaton.
Yeah, I did know. We did happen to mention that. But I went around the college, went around the country while I was writing this book, talking to a lot of different faculties. And I talked to Yale Divinity School, Columbia. The best group by far was at Wheaton, because they were used to applying the lessons of theology to practical questions of life. And it wasn't just an academic exercise for them. But too often in the Christian world, the kindness overcomes intellectual rigor, and the spiritual superiority just gets the back of people's neck up.
How, as somebody writing about these issues, where you write about them, can you talk a little bit about the blowback that you have gotten? I just assume that even by using a word like sin or talking about character, that it gets certain people, it gets their back up, and they would accuse you of, shoving your religion down their throats, even though you're not even talking really about religion. What has that been?
Yeah, I do two things. I did a bunch of events for Strange Reasons with hedge fund guys in the world of finance in New York. And there was a lot of them loved it. Their wives really loved it. But the guys were a little anxious about it. And one of the guys came up to me after a talk and he said, you just make me feel guilty. And I live my life by a certain standard. I'm happy with myself. I don't really need to hear this. And actually one of my students, after taking the class, he said, I love this class, but since taking it, I'm a lot sadder, which I took as a high compliment. That's like what I'm trying to do. But so there's some blowback about that. And then there just is, there's just a lot of hostility to religion in the culture. There's just the idea that somebody could be faithful rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And so I've been shocked in the radio call-in shows, just the level of the waves of hostility about that. It's from a minority, but it's out there.
Well, we live in a pretty secular culture, and so I'm not surprised. So I want to commend you for your courage in writing about this. I think that where you are to write about this is courageous.
I'll say one thing, having taught at Yale now over a long stretch of time, it used to be religion was something they were embarrassed about. Then 5 years ago, it was something they were neutral about. Now it's a sign of coolness. If you're religious, it's a sign that you have some spiritual depth going on there. And my students admire it in the kids who are Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Jews who are out, who are just talking about it honestly. My kids admire those kids.
I'm staggered to hear that. There's good news. That's really good news. We promised David that we would get him in a cab about 5 minutes from now, so I'll ask one final question. When you were referring to Tim Keller and him talking about disordered loves, immediately I thought of C.S. Lewis, because most of us who've read Tim Keller's work know that he really has ripped off Lewis for it's decades now. And what's amazing is he's shameless about it. He appears to have no conscience. And I'm so glad he's not here. But the thing is that Lewis is so great, C.S. Lewis is so great, that I realized Tim Keller wouldn't be Tim Keller if C.S. Lewis had not existed, because Lewis to me is that rare. He brought an entire literature into the world, not just a book or something like that. And I guess just to editorialize, one of the reasons to be pro-life is you think that there's one person, if he hadn't existed, it's unfathomable to me how different the world would be, because how many people have been affected. But I know that Lewis is someone whose works have been part of shaping your thinking on this. Tell us about your introduction to Lewis, what books of his you like, and what kind of influence he's had on you personally.
Yeah, well, first, I'm someone who rips off Tim Keller. So we call it research. We don't really call it stealing. But the first thing I say to all my students, if you want to learn to write well, read two people, C.S. Lewis and George Orwell's essays. And they both are extremely clear writers because they wrote for radio and they wrote for listened word. And one of the things Lewis teaches you is never use a big word, a pompous word, when a simple word will do. And so
he stole that from E.B. White.
who stole it from Moses. Uh, Look at you, Mr. C-SPAN Jesus over here.
I just want to say Moses stole it from Zipporah.
But so Lewis was just a great writer, so he'll say he doesn't use the word soul. He'll say you have a core piece of yourself, which is the piece that makes decisions, and when you make decisions that are beautiful, you turn that core piece into something nicer. When you make disorganized and disciplined decisions, you degrade that core piece. And that's just such an easy way to talk about the soul, that it welcomes you in. And I would say for me, one of the things I love, there are all sorts of ways one learns from faith. You read Augustine, probably the smartest human being I've ever encountered. You read, there's a guy named Joseph Soloveitchik, who I rely on, the book of Rabbi, who's so emotionally rich. But Lewis is, he discovered faith that there's the new biography a lot of people have probably read, because it just explained the world. And we all probably in this room know the description of his religion, his conversion in Surprised by Joy. To discover faith in a moment of ecstasy is great. To discover faith in a moment of tragedy is redeeming. I would highly recommend, I'm sure a lot of people have read Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken. But to have experienced it as a mode of understanding shows that reading and thinking can be a morally and spiritually uplifting enterprise. It's not just for information, it's not just so you can manage well, it can be a way of hardening yourself and forming your soul. And so for Lewis, I think he's a bit of an example of that. And another character in my book, Samuel Johnson, is the same.
I'll ask you one very quick question, and then we're going to escort you out so you can get home quickly. David has this crazy idea that he needs to spend time with his family.
I do apologize. I'm on book tour, so this is like
no.
I'm away for 5 weeks.
You don't apologize. We're all about that, really. That's kind of why we're away from our families this weekend. But final question: death. Have you come to terms with the prospect of your own death?
No. I'm reasonably young, 53, I hope. I would say I haven't. I would say the things that have changed me in the last couple of years are two. One, these moments of joy. But then there have been moments of suffering, and we all go through them. And then there have been moments of love. And what suffering does, there's a Paul Tillich, a great theologian. I highly recommend reading a book called Shaking the Foundations, a series of sermons by him. He says what suffering does, is those moments of suffering when you've lost a loved one or a job or a romantic love, is it takes you beneath the everydayness of life and reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. It carves into the basement of your soul, through the floor, revealing a cavity below, and then it carves through that, revealing a cavity below. And so what suffering does is it really introduces you to yourself. And the activity that often goes along with suffering is love. Love decenters the self. It humbles you because you're not in control of your mind. It makes you fuse with another. And all of these things, in any age, open up hard ground and reveal vulnerable parts. And I think going to a religious service does that as well. And so I confess I have not thought about my death. I think I'm aging backwards. I'm Benjamin Button. I've got another 70 years. No, I'm completely self-deluded about that. But I do think in the middle of life, even if you're not fully prepared for death, you can be fully prepared for the life that involves the full panoply of emotion, of love, of suffering, and to leave life in a spiritually awakened manner. And so that's more or less what I'm going through, not preparing for the ultimate.
Well, we're going to part the Red Sea so that you can get to your cab. And just before we do that, I think an NCS round of applause for our guest, David Brooks.